The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde. A long, long time ago, in a land somewhere in Europe, was a quiet little city with people both rich and poor, happy and sad. But what was most beautiful in the city was a statue of a happy prince that stood high up on a tall stone column, looking over all the people, buildings, and life there. The statue of the happy prince was gilded all over with thin leaves of fine gold. He had eyes of the rarest sapphires that were brought over to the city from India 1,000 years ago. And on the hilt of his sword was the biggest ruby ever that glowed a bright red. Oh, how beautiful a prince he was! The mayor thought it. The town councillors who copied the mayor thought it. A mother scolding her child who was crying thought it too, as she wanted her daughter to be as happy as the prince. The charity children from the city's church thought it as well. Everyone thought the same about the wonderful statue of the happy prince. Legend had it that when the prince was alive, with a beating human heart, he did not know any sorrow. He was always happy and never cried. He lived in a palace in the heart of the city where sadness was not allowed to enter. So during the day, he would run around his delightful gardens with his companions, and in the evenings, he would host grand balls that would have him and his friends dance through the nights into the wee hours of the mornings. He was beautiful, and he had all the pleasures he needed in the palace itself. He was called the Happy Prince, and happy he most definitely was. That is why he never had the need to know what was beyond the high palace walls. He lived happy and he died happy. But his happiness changed when he was put up high on the tall stone column overlooking the entire city. One winter's evening, a little swallow flew over the city on his way to the summer in Egypt. He was supposed to have gone with his friends and family 6 weeks ago, but he had hopelessly fallen in love with a reed. A reed, a tall grass-like plant. Rightfully so, his friends and family thought he had lost his mind. "It is a ridiculous attachment," the other swallows twittered. And so they left their love-struck companion behind, who realized after 6 painfully quiet weeks, with no one to speak to or fly with, that he missed the other swallows. So he asked the reed whether she would accompany him to Egypt, and when he was met with a silent sway that looked more like a no than a yes, he bid her goodbye and flew away. Once the little swallow reached the city of the happy prince, he felt very tired. He decided to rest the night at the city and continue his journey the next day. But he wondered where it was that he could take shelter, and it was then that his gaze fell upon the brilliant statue of the happy prince. "I will put up there," he cried. "It is a fine position with plenty of fresh air." And he flew to the statue and settled between the prince's golden feet. But as he was getting comfortable and ready to tuck his head into his wing to fall asleep, a large water drop fell on his head. The swallow looked up at the sky and saw that the night was clear, with not a cloud in sight. "That is strange," mumbled the little swallow to himself. He shook off the water and was just about to settle in again when 2 more drops fell on his head and soaked him completely. This time, instead of looking at the sky, he looked at the happy prince. But the prince was not happy at all. Tears of sadness were rolling down the prince's face. The swallow quickly flew up and landed on the prince's shoulder. "What's wrong?" the swallow asked gently. And it is then that the happy prince introduced himself and shared his life story with the bird. How he lived in the palace in the city, never knew any sadness, and did not ever think of finding out how life was for his people living outside of the palace walls. But now, high up above the city, where he could see all its ugliness and misery, he could not help but weep. "Far away," continued the statue in a low voice, "far away in a little street there is a poor house. One of the windows is open, and through it I can see a woman seated at a table. Her face is thin and worn, and she has coarse red hands, all pricked by the needle, for she is a seamstress. She is embroidering passion flowers on a satin gown for the Queen's maid of honor to wear at the next court ball. In a bed in the corner of the room, her little boy is lying ill. He has a fever and is asking for oranges. His mother has nothing to give him but river water, so he is crying, 'Swallow, swallow, little swallow, will you not bring her the ruby of my sword hilt? My feet are fastened to the pedestal, and I cannot move.' The swallow explained to the prince that he was expected to meet his friends and family in Egypt by the river Nile to spend the summer together, but the prince would not have it. 'Swallow, swallow, little swallow,' said the prince, 'will you not stay with me for one night and be my messenger? The boy is so thirsty and the mother so sad.' The swallow was about to turn down the happy prince's request, but then he saw how sad he was and he changed his mind. 'It is very cold here,' said the swallow, 'but I will stay with you for one night and be your messenger.' 'Thank you, little swallow,' said the prince. So the swallow flew down to the sword hilt, pecked out the dazzling red ruby, and carried it in his beak all the way to the little house on the little street. Once he got to the house, he peered inside and saw the boy tossing feverishly on his bed, while his mother lay fast asleep beside him, tired and ragged from a long and hard day of work. The swallow hopped into the house through the open window and laid the ruby on the mother's sewing table next to her thimble. He then flew to the boy's forehead and started flapping his little wings vigorously to cool him down, till the boy was fast asleep himself. Content with his work and feeling warm from being kind and doing good, despite it being a cold winter's night, the little swallow flew back to the happy prince, nestled himself between the statue's feet, and sank into a much-deserved, delicious slumber. When morning came, the swallow went and bathed in the city's river, visited all of its famous monuments, and spent time sitting on the church's steeple. And as the moon rose, he flew back to the happy prince to bid him farewell, as it was time for him to continue his flight to Egypt. But when he got to the statue, the prince said, "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, will you not stay with me one night longer?" And as the swallow was about to protest, the happy prince explained, "Far away across the city I see a young man in an attic. He is leaning over a desk covered with papers, and in a tumbler by his side there is a bunch of withered violets. His hair is brown and crisp, and his lips are red as a pomegranate, and he has large and dreamy eyes. He is trying to finish a play for the director of the theatre, but he is too cold to write anymore. There is no fire in the grate, and hunger has made him faint." Sad to learn this, the swallow decided to stay one more night and help the happy prince and be his messenger. Upon hearing the little swallow's decision to stay one more night, the prince thanked him and this time asked him to take out one of his sapphire eyes and give it to the young man. The swallow immediately objected to doing this. After all, how could he take the prince's eye and make him half blind? But the prince commanded him, and the swallow obeyed. And off he went to the distressed and poor young man, carrying the brilliant sapphire in his beak. Once he got to the attic, he hopped in through the open window and placed the sapphire on the table next to the tumbler with the withered violets. The young man woke up just then and saw the sapphire. He cried, thinking it a blessing, and was happy that he now had the means to finish his play. The next morning, the little swallow flew through the city admiring it, and visited the harbour, where he sat on the mast of a large ship, observing the sailors as they worked around him. And as the moon rose again, he made his way back to the happy prince to bid him farewell and carry on with his journey to Egypt. But the prince said, "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, will you not stay with me one night longer?" The little swallow explained that the nights were getting colder and he needed to leave before it started snowing, to which the prince replied, "In the square below there stands a little match girl. She has let her matches fall into the gutter and they are all spoiled. Her father will beat her if she does not bring home some money, and she is crying. She has no shoes or stockings and her little head is bare. Pluck out my other eye and give it to her, and her father will not beat her." The little swallow agreed to stay and help one more night, but refused to take the prince's other eye, as that would leave him completely blind. But the prince commanded him, and he obeyed. He plucked out the precious sapphire eye and flew it down to the little match girl, dropping it into her right palm. The girl squealed out of joy and skipped straight back home to show her father. The swallow flew back to the happy prince, perched on his shoulder and said, "You are blind now, so I will stay with you always." And the little swallow kept his word. In the coming days, he sat on the prince's shoulder and shared many stories from his travels. He also flew through the city and told the prince how the rich made merry in the beautiful homes, and the poor suffered limitlessly from the cold and hunger in the hopeless and dark lanes of the land. The prince asked the swallow to pick the leaves of fine gold covering all of the statue's body and give the gold to all in need. So the little swallow did just that, till the happy prince was cold and bare and had nothing more to give. It is at this time, as the gold on the statue's body finished, that snow started falling all over the city, and it had become too cold for the little swallow. He knew he could survive no longer, so he flew up to his friend, kissed the happy prince goodbye, and fell to the prince's feet, dead. Now, what no one knew was that even though the happy prince did not have a human heart, he had a heart of lead, and with the fall of his little friend, there was a loud sound, and the prince's lead heart cracked in two. The next morning, the mayor and town councillors came across the town statue and grimaced at how bare, plain, and ugly the statue of the happy prince had become. They also noticed the dead bird at the prince's feet, and they decided to tear down the statue and melt it in a large and hot furnace so they could use the material to build another statue which would be beautiful and replace the now plain statue of the prince. But they could melt everything except the prince's lead heart. How strange! So they decided to throw the heart in the same dump that they threw the little swallow in. All this time, though, God was watching everything. Once the heart and the bird were thrown away, he asked his angels to bring him the two things the angels thought were most precious in the city. The angels flew down and brought back the lead heart and the bird. And the happy prince and the little swallow lived happily ever after together in heaven. The end.